I'm an investigative journalist and an attorney. In fact, I was an investigative journalist a lot longer than I have been as an attorney. I started out in 1970, early 70s, when I was in Beirut, Lebanon. Because I'd been born in Beirut, my father was in the Foreign Service. He died when I was very young. Spent my life growing up in the States, but I went back to Beirut with my mother in high school, fell in love with the Middle East, and then after college and graduate school, ended up going back there. My mother by then had died. My father died when I was an infant. And so I was a journalist, and I traveled all over the Middle East, and I'm sure that probably subconsciously more than anything had a role in my decision to take on George W. Bush for leading us into a war on false premises. I'd been to Iraq. I had seen what a wonderful country it was. That was in the mid-'70s. And the people were free and secular, and there were art exhibits all over the place, and it was really looking like the beacon of hope for the Middle East. And, well, we all know what happened since then, and Saddam Hussein came in power, and ultimately we flash forward to the United States getting involved in a preemptive war. And so there was the combination of the horrendous suffering of the Iraqi people that really bothered me intensely, and also, of course, sending our troops over there for an unnecessary reason. It was all based on a lie. It happened that a friend of mine, a very close friend of mine, put a copy of Vincent Bugliosi's book in my hands, and that book is entitled The Prosecution of George W. Bush for Murder. And there is a section in the book that says that any district attorney or any attorney general can prosecute Bush. And I thought, you know, I'm running for attorney general. I'd already decided to run before she even gave me the book. And I was considering what the issues were going to be. And then when I read that any attorney general could do this, I thought, well, I'm not an attorney general yet, but I could make it part of my campaign. I was able to meet Vincent, and we just hit it off. And then he started explaining to me what was both the evidence for why he believed that, without a shadow of a doubt, he could prove that Bush had taken us to war on false pretenses, and that he could also prove the argument of murder. A lot of people think that you can't go after a president at all, that the president has immunity. The president has immunity while he's in office. But when he's outside of office, he's like you or me. He's just a regular citizen. So Vincent was able to change his schedule and come up to Vermont and be with me when I had a press conference announcing that I was going to run for Attorney General. I made my announcement, and I said, I have a special guest here, Vincent Bugliosi, and although this is not the only subject that I'm going to run on, the prosecution of George W. Bush will be one of the issues that I will be addressing, and should I succeed, I intend to appoint Vincent Bugliosi as my special prosecutor. Mind you, here I am sitting next to one of the most famous prosecutors in America. He's most well known for the book Helter Skelter, which describes his prosecution of the Manson family that murdered Sharon Tate and some other people. I knew at the press conference that the buzz was going to be about this particular issue. And I had a famous prosecutor sitting next to me, and it wasn't every day that someone would challenge the President of the United States in their own home state, but there really were some very other serious issues. I touch upon them in the book. I don't dwell upon them because this issue in and of itself became huge. Over 60% of the people in Vermont had been polled as being very much opposed to the war in Iraq. So I figured that there would be a receptive audience on that. Secondly, there had been a very interesting and effective impeachment movement in Vermont, in which over 30 towns voted on their town meeting days to impeach George Bush. And there were some local activists. They brought up the peace mom, Cindy Sheen, who had lost her son in the war in Iraq, the woman who had camped outside of Bush's ranch, who probably remember about Camp Casey. Anyway, she came to Vermont, and with some of the leaders of that movement, Dan DeWalt, he's from the Brattleboro area, went around to the different towns, explained why this war was wrong, and got a very resounding response on town meeting day, and this made national news. So I figured that I already had a base of support if I could just go and reach those towns. Then there was we almost got it passed through the Vermont legislature, and the Senate had passed a resolution to impeach, and it almost got passed in the House. Unfortunately, it was killed by senior Democratic Party leaders, and if it had succeeded, there was a sort of an old rules of the House of Representatives that if a state legislature resolves or votes for impeachment, then the House of Representatives has to take it up. So unfortunately that got killed in the House, but we came a long way. Then there was a sad reason for running, and the sad reason was that Vermont is a small state, but we have the highest per capita number of deaths of soldiers lost in Iraq. So that made it another compelling reason for us to go ahead with this. The torture issue started to get bigger and bigger after the elections, after I had lost the election, which didn't surprise me. But eventually we would learn, I believe it was in April with the release of some more of the memos of the lawyers, that the worst torturing that went on was in the months leading up to the war in Iraq. And they were done on what are called high-profile detainees, the so-called 9/11 suspects. These were a couple of individuals who were, thought were top material, Al-Qaeda material, and they were waterboarded, and it came out, waterboarding, as we all know, is coming as close to drowning as you can be without drowning and terrifying the torture victim. And we learned that torture had occurred hundreds of times and had been performed on these individuals. Why? Not to get actionable intelligence, so to call, not to get information about Al-Qaeda, for instance. No, the purpose of this torture was to get them to make false confessions. And what were the false confessions? That they had links to Saddam Hussein, that they were involved in 9/11. And they were so desperate to come up with a pretext that they tortured people. There's a point in Bugliosi's book when he says, what could possibly be worse than to send our young soldiers to war on a lie? And I say in my book, well, something possibly could be even worse than that, which is to torture people as well as sending our troops on a lie. There's ample evidence now that the White House, Dick Cheney, Condoleezza Rice, and Donald Rumsfeld, they used to sit around in a room and talk about what kind of enhanced interrogation could be performed on these detainees. The calls for prosecuting them as war criminals became a very overwhelming demand in the accountability movement. And this happened to coincide with the very time that President Obama had come into office. It was Eric Holder, his Attorney General, who released the memos. And when he did release those memos, there was a lot of soul searching, I think, that went on with Obama and with him. I read that Obama spent many sleepless nights trying to decide what to do because he was getting a lot of pressure from the CIA not to release these damning memos. Because what do the damning memos do? They show not only that the decision to torture went right up to the top, it wasn't just a few bad apples, but it also showed that it was the CIA that was doing the interrogating. And they were breaking the law in the process because there are laws in place that prohibit torture. There's the Torture Convention, for instance. There's the War Crimes Act of 1996, which our country signed. So if you sign a treaty or a convention, then you are obligated not to torture. It's a crime. And if you do torture, you're a war criminal. So anyway, I think that Attorney General Holder and President Obama knew that by releasing these memos, all hell was going to break loose, and it did. And on the one hand, the ACLU was very gratified that this had been done, because then it's going to help them in their numerous lawsuits, helping detainees try to get free, and also try to have a proper defense that they were tortured. Therefore, the evidence against them can't be used in court. So the reason why the ACLU was able to get these was because they had filed a Freedom of Information lawsuit. And actually, Obama really, if he's going to live up to his claim that he's going to be transparent and that he believes in the rule of law, then the rule of law required him to release these memos, and through a Freedom of Information lawsuit. So I think he really didn't have much of a choice, and I'm glad that he did it. He got a lot of flack for it, and I think that the right wing of the Republican Party and the intelligence community are still fighting him very hard. As you know, he did not release the torture memos. The torture photos. There are thousands of them, and the argument that he's been using is that they weren't released because they could endanger our soldiers abroad. That sounds like a CIA argument. I think that most people in the world know that it happened, and it's my belief that if they were released, they would be so damning that there would be once again just a practical uprising demanding that there be a special prosecutor appointed to look into the top people in the Bush administration as war criminals. My book covers all of this. I had started out on the war issue, and one issue that I want to make clear is that we shouldn't forget about the war. The murder charge is something that I had to explain over and over again as I went on the campaign trail, as has Vincent Bugliosi. And I wanted to just explain a few things because it's really not so outlandish as one might think. The first objection that people have is, how can you possibly charge George W. Bush for murder when he didn't come into the state of Vermont, and who are his victims? His victims weren't even in Vermont, they were in Iraq. And so how could you even bring this case into Vermont? Well, one of the ways you can get jurisdiction, for instance, in Vermont, is simply through a conspiracy to commit murder. And all you have to show is that George Bush and some of the other principals involved, top-level people, decided that they were going to engage in a preemptive war in Iraq, and that George Bush was going to go on national television, and he was going to talk about the threat of Saddam Hussein and his weapons of mass destruction, which is exactly what he did. And he ignored advice from his national intelligence estimates, which basically said that Saddam Hussein is not a threat. And he went on TV and said the opposite. And that TV message was beamed, of course, all over the United States, including into the homes of Vermonters. And I'm sure it had an impact on young Vermont men and women who felt that it was their patriotic duty to take up arms against Saddam Hussein. And as you know, Bush also tried to link Saddam Hussein to 9/11, which was also absolutely false. Saddam Hussein was not involved, and it was proved that he was not involved. But if you can use this emotional argument that he was, it will get young people who are patriotic to sign up. And so that's what happened. And that is what we would call the overt act that occurred in Vermont as a result of the conspiracy. You have to show an overt act furthering the conspiracy to land jurisdiction in Vermont. So troops went off to war thinking they were doing the right thing and the patriotic thing. And also there were recruitment centers in Vermont. That was another overt act because they were linked right up to Washington, D.C. And so that helps establish the conspiracy, the jurisdiction for conspiracy. Then there are some other doctrines that are used in law. One of them is called the effects doctrine, and that also helps establish jurisdiction. And that is simply that if something happens outside of a jurisdiction, for instance, well, let's just say Bush going in front of the TV in Washington, D.C., and it has an adverse effect on the state. And in this case, it would be sending troops to their deaths from Vermont. Another adverse effect of this war has been the economy. I'm sure that it can be shown that the economy has suffered adversely because of this war, including in Vermont. Those are a couple of adverse effects that allow us to establish jurisdiction in Vermont. Then there's an argument called the third-party innocent agent. The best way to illustrate this is actually comes through in a conversation that Vincent Bugliosi had with Cindy Sheehan, the peace mom who lost her son in Iraq. And she was talking to him in the summer of '08. His book had just come out, and she said to him, without even having read the book, she said, "You know, it wasn't the Iraqis that killed my son. It was President Bush who killed my son." And the whole point of a third-party innocent agent is that the Bush administration launched a preemptive war, and the Iraqis acted in self-defense. They were being invaded, and they had the right to defend themselves. So therefore, if they killed the American soldiers, then they can't be regarded as the perpetrators. They can't be liable. It's the person who started it, and that would be Bush. They are third-party innocent agents. So for that reason, it's another reason why he can be held accountable for this. 4,000 troops lost their lives thinking they were protecting our country, and instead they lost their lives because they were protecting the interests of the narrow interests of a very small group of people who had literally hijacked our government, completely taken it over, and come up with a whole bunch of phony laws giving extraordinary power to the president to do whatever he wanted, including go to war. Some people have said that because Congress went along with it, that they'd have to be held liable. But Congress was lied to. The bottom line in all of this is, what is Bush's defense? Supposing we were to bring him to trial in a Vermont courtroom or in any other courtroom in the United States where we could find an elected district attorney or an attorney general, what would his defense be to murder? He's only got one defense. His defense is self-defense, that Saddam Hussein was an imminent threat. And we've already proven that he was not. So therefore his self-defense falls. And Bugliosi and I are both very confident that if an American jury was able to hear all of the elements of the crime, all of the evidence against him, that they would convict. Some people say, well, did he really intend to murder these soldiers? And the answer is, well, no, he didn't intend to, go out and individually kill or have killed soldiers. But he obviously knew that by sending them into war on false pretenses, they were going to die. He knew that. He had the intent, therefore it can be argued in a court of law, to kill. There's also another concept, which is that that he didn't necessarily have to show that he had intent, but rather that the deaths were sort of a consequence of his very reckless actions that took place, and without any care of loss of human life. And that's what's called implied malice. The intent to kill is express malice. He intended to send those troops off to war, and he knew that death would result. The implied malice is that he knew that he was sending them into harm's way. He was acting in a very reckless manner, and that great harm would come to them. And so you can get him, it's also on that count. So all the elements of the crime are covered, and it can be done. There is, I'm not at liberty to say much more as to whether Vincent Bugliosi has been successful in finding a prosecutor to do this, beyond saying that there are some people looking at it very carefully, and it may take a while. I think that the more evidence that comes out, the more people are going to be clamoring for some kind of accountability. The word retribution has been used recently to not have prosecutions, and retribution, it's a word in our legal discourse. It just means exacting punishment. These people were war criminals. They should be punished, just like war criminals were punished during the Nazi era, and they were. Even the lawyers were. And I actually think that Bush and Cheney and company are quite concerned about this. They actually went about changing laws so that neither they nor the people carrying out the torture would be convicted of war crimes. They actually narrowed the definition for torture. Torture had to be that you were going to cause grave organ failure or physical bodily harm near death to have it be called torture, and they thought that this was going to let them off the hook. But in fact, not only has that been proven, some of the detainees have died because of the torture. And what we're finding out is a lot of these people were innocent. This is just outrageous what went on in the previous administration. What we had here was some people call it a coup d'etat, a silent, secret coup d'etat. We didn't even know how much they had been running our government by writ, just by order, because the president says that this has to happen. The president says that we have to go to war. The president says that we have to wiretap Americans and break existing law on that. Which meant not going to a judge and getting a warrant. The president, because the president is all-powerful, has the right to set up military commissions to try the detainees, which are nothing more than kangaroo courts. These people had absolutely no rights. It blows my mind what this past administration did, and the point is, what do you do about it? There have been arguments, even from our own Senator Leahy, that we have a truth commission, that the most important thing is to get the information first. And he's a former prosecutor. I can't have a crystal ball and know exactly what he's thinking about as to why this is a preferable route to go. But his idea was get as many witnesses in there, grant them immunity, and maybe they'll talk. And he's said that by doing so, we'll see what information we get. And maybe eventually we'll go after the top people, because with prosecutions, usually it's just the folks, the little guys, which is what happened with, of course, Abu Ghraib. It was the soldiers on the ground that got tried and convicted rather than the higher-ups. Right from the get-go, even before the election of President Obama, he was saying that he wanted to move forward. He wasn't interested in prosecutions. And he'd rather move forward than going backward. And that became kind of a mantra. It became a mantra of his before the election and after the election. And it had a lot of people quite upset, actually. Human rights lawyers, activists who cared about our having justice for the people that had been so harmed. And but I tracked that, and I do this in the book very carefully. I was reading his words very carefully. And when he would say, I would rather move forward, he would also say, but if crimes have been committed, then they should be investigated. And well, who does that? That's the Attorney General. So even very early in the Obama administration, he was leaving the possibility that whereas he had to move forward, and let's face it, he had a lot of things on his plate, which we all know, the sinking economy, healthcare reform were two gigantic issues. While he could still move forward, his Attorney General, by law, had to deal with this because torture is illegal and because Eric Holder himself said waterboarding is illegal. So therefore, he chose his words very carefully, and now we're at a point where Eric Holder is saying that he may, in fact, seriously bring some charges to do a criminal investigation. And I think what has really tipped it over, the decision to possibly go backward and then go forward, namely doing a prosecution, because as it's been argued, doing a prosecution is going forward. It's affirming that we care about the rule of law, and it tells the whole world and the American people that that's what we're about. So it is moving forward. It's not moving backward. The second part of my book is about the accountability movement that I met along the way. That's even in the title. I started out by discovering all these people that were involved in impeachment and very active in it. I mean, at any given time, some of these leaders of the movement could put out an email blast to well over 200,000 people just on that issue alone, and they were tremendously supportive to my campaign. I got contributions from all over the country, so that's where I started learning about a movement that I didn't know it was so big. Then, after that, when the torture issue came out, I started to talk to lawyers, and I found out these wonderful human rights lawyers, the Center for Constitutional Rights, as I said, the ACLU. Then I found women's groups like Code Pink, which was an anti-war group sort of mocking the terrorist threat levels. They took up, instead of Code Orange or Code Red, they took Code Pink. And they've done extraordinary things. They're constantly keeping on the pressure outside the Department of Justice, outside Congress. They go into Congress, they hold up signs, they say torture is illegal. There have been groups called Witness Against Torture that all over the country they walk around in orange jumpsuits with black hoods on them. I'm very interested to find that so many women are active right now. There's another group called World Can't Wait that was organized by a woman, and they've been participating. Most recently, they've been going to John Yu's house, one of the lawyers who is teaching at Berkeley, and they're protesting that Berkeley should not have such a person on their campus. So the movement is out there. The problem is the media is not covering it, and I cannot recommend highly enough some of the alternative media and the blogs that are doing it. That would mean, like, for instance, Democracy Now! And Grit TV have been fantastic in covering these issues and the people involved in the movement. Then there are blogs. Glenn Greenwald is a former constitutional attorney who's been constantly keeping the pressure on the Obama administration in a very intelligent way. Jonathan Turley, who often shows up on MSNBC, has been saying what we need is prosecution and proving it. And who else has it? Scott Horton, writing for Harper's Magazine, is also very reliable. So the movement is there, and we need more people to get involved, because even though Obama is the president now, many of these issues are still going on. There's still detention. Things are worse in Guantanamo. And we can't just be confident because he signed an order saying torture will end. We have to do what he asked us to do, which is, he said, it's not up to me, it's up to you. He needs to hear from us, because if we don't keep active, we may go back to what it was under Bush in a new election. We need to preserve our democracy and fight for it. And I will have on my website and in the book a sort of field guide so people can see where to go to get involved.